So we're pretty excited this week to have a couple really special guests join us. Matt here from Double Mountain Brewery and Joe O'Sullivan, the distiller over at Clear Creek Distillery, is known for making McCarthy's in the single malt whiskey world. And so I want to take a little bit of time here right off the bat to kind of get to know them a little bit better and introduce them properly. So Matt, if you could, tell us a little bit about yourself here to start off, where are you from? What got you into brewing in the first place, and how long have you been doing it now?
Well, it's let's see. I grew up in Indiana, so I hailed from just outside the great town of Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is exactly flat and not very interesting. And I started off as an aerospace engineer because I was into flying. I was into airplanes. My dad. And he was a flyer. We had a little airstrip on our farm, which is a wheat farm, and I learned to fly in and out of there when I was about 16. But then when, as an engineer, I kind of got discouraged when we went into the first Iraq War. My pacifism got a little heavy, and I just decided that the Department of Defense wasn't my gig. And so I quit and tried to get something else to do. And after several years of doing all sorts of random things, vacuum cleaner repair being one of the key ones, I decided to become a brewer and went to beer school in Chicago, and then interned at a few breweries, and then went to work in Hood River here at Full Sail Brewing Company, and I was there for about 13 years. And left there to start Double Mountain Brewery in 2006, and it's gone really well since then. I love the artistry of making beer. The things I didn't like about engineering was the minuteness that you can get involved in a project, designing a very tiny part or a very small system. And I loved making beer because it had complexity. And at the end of the day, you're assembling all these ideas and all these processes, and you get to evaluate it and drink it and let you know if you did a good job or not. So it was a combination of left brain and right brain that really appealed to me.
That's awesome. Was there a certain mentor that you may have had along the way?
There's a bunch. No, a bunch of guys. My first real exposure. I worked at this home beer supply shop, and I met a guy named John Mallett, who is the brewmaster at Bell's Brewing in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he was running a brewery out there called Old Dominion in Virginia. And I'd known him socially. He was a kind of a Greenpeace activist. And I went out and started interviewing him, if you will, to see if I, was brewing a good career. Did he recommend it? And he did everything in his power to discourage me from getting involved in the industry. And he said, "You're not just, some guy living in the mountains in Vermont making beer. It's not how it's going to work." And but he was great, and he had a long career, and ended up really taking Bell's Brewing, kind of to some great heights. It's a well-respected brewery. I love their Two Hearted Ale, and so he's kind of been an inspiration throughout the whole time. And then my instructors when I was at school in Chicago, a lot of great guys from Labatt's, from Budweiser, from Molson Coors. It was kind of when the big breweries were really in charge, and so I learned how to make industrial beer as one of the first little guys coming to it. So it was a great education.
Awesome. Yeah, the community's so amazing. I think that's the one thing that kind of gravitates a lot of us and keeps us around, is the quality of people that we end up meeting and working with along the way.
I agree, yeah.
There's something really interesting that you guys are doing at Double Mountain now that I think, now it makes a lot more sense hearing about your background in engineering, but your bottle recycling program. Could you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so we, I'm a firm believer in, you make choices that are the best for the quality of the product. So when we went to move beyond draft beer and put our beer in a package, just glass is a much preferred contact surface for beer. It's got a small opening. You can get all the oxygen out of the container which is the death nail for beer quality, is oxygen ingress. And so canning was just kind of something we would never consider because the oxygen levels are high, it has poor storage. And then when you look at the environmental footprint of mining aluminum and the carbon that it takes, it's quite an assault, environmentally. So using a refillable bottle, if you look at the life cycle of that old technology, I mean, people were putting beer in refillable bottles, back in the 10s and the 20s, and it used to be the standard in the United States, and most of the world still uses a returnable, refillable bottle. But the life cycle carbon of our refillable glass is about 67 times smaller than a can. It's a no-brainer. You can drink 67 beers and have the same amount of carbon impact than drinking one can of beer. So you combine the lower cost of refillable bottles with the higher quality and the environmental package. It's really the way to go. It's not the way the market is going, I will admit, and because cans are quite popular. But I think the more and more we learn about global warming, the more consumers will come around and really appreciate it. Our locals really have embraced the program. So I think we did about 50 or 60,000 bottles last year, and we expect to double that this year.
Wow.
So
yeah. One of the reasons I love Hood River. Community gets behind stuff like that.
We're a little wacko down here.
We are, and it's lovable. It's the reason I love it.
Yeah.
And Joe, what about yourself? You want to tell us all a little bit about where you're from and how you got started in the distillation world?
It's going to sound eerily similar to Matt's. I also come out with science backgrounds. And also, I have to say, before I overlook somebody really important, you're going to see somebody with the name Bartolome on that. I'm one of two distillers. I'm the head distiller. My lead distiller is Caitlin Bartolome. She is an incredible force in the distilling world, and I take every opportunity to make sure that people know who she is and her contribution to this industry. So Caitlin Bartolome is also on the line, and an incredible woman. But going back to Cody's question, which is all about me and therefore more important, I came into it in a very similar way. I actually also have a science background. I was a biologist. I grew up in Massachusetts from a fishing family out at the end of Cape Cod. Was really involved in biology throughout all of college and grew that passion into working for the Department of Natural Resources, specifically focusing on aquaculture. After a little while, decided that I wanted to try new avenues and wound up working at Harvard Med School. And after a fair amount of time working in research labs, I decided it wasn't quite for me. There was some probably obvious stuff that happens in research labs that was a little bit too gruesome for me, and I wanted to pull myself out of it. And so wound up kind of spending some time wandering around. I was a dog walker. I was a carpenter. I spent a lot of time as a carpenter. I was a cabinet maker. I even spent a short amount of time looking at a boat building school in Maine. And then when I moved out to Idaho in 2004, I thought I'd just kind of hang around there for a little while, but it wasn't for me. And so I wound up moving out to Portland. And this was in January of 2005, right after the new year, and fell in love with it. I actually thought I was getting a job at a crate building warehouse when I knocked on the doors of Clear Creek Distillery. And so I didn't really have anything that brought me into distillation as a passion. I don't really have that philosophy about work. It's never really been that for me. I think it's a little bit of a disservice that we often give to people to say, find a job you love. I think it's way more logical to say, find a way to love your job, because most of us don't get that choice. And if we do have that choice, well, that's a huge benefit that we just have, that we seem to assume other people just kind of trip into, but it's just kind of luck. I did, however, tend to really love what I did. It was super easy to find a way to love how to distill. At the time, there wasn't a lot of people doing it. And so it had this arcane kind of patina on it that made it neat. And I still remember going to my, gosh, what would have been? Yeah, 10-year high school reunion and being like, yeah, I make whiskey in Oregon, you know, and just people thinking that that was the best response of what you could do. It was shortly, oh, those are some of my stills. I spent about 5 years working for Steve McCarthy, who was my mentor through all this and considered one of the godfathers of American craft distilling, before moving to New York City to start consulting on and building out the first distilleries there, which was also a great honor and a little bit of a strategic move to push a career that I could see was going to become a lot more competitive very quickly. And after working in New York for 5 years and living in Flatbush, Brooklyn, I decided that it was time to go for a smaller world again and moved back to Oregon. Spent about 1.5 years remodeling homes before I was hired to run Clear Creek. And I still feel that that's one of the greatest honors a distiller could get is running that shop. And I've been doing it with incredible pride ever since. I'm very, very lucky to be where I'm at. And I do think that it's one of the best distilleries in the country without bias.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think one of the most impressive things that you guys are able to do is create incredibly high quality products across a wide range that are a really cool reflection of what we have here available to us in Hood River directly. When you think about the agriculture and the history behind this place here in the country, in the Columbia Gorge. Do you personally have a project that you guys work on that you find to be your favorite or something that you might take extra pride in? I know asking somebody about their favorite children is always hard, and I'm sure Bartolome probably has something to say about this as well, but what stands out to you, would you say?
Well, I mean, there's children that you know, they're around and you like them because again, you don't hope to get the child you love. You find a way to love your child. It's just like a job. Children are just like work. So we tend to be pretty honest about this. There's a couple, and for different reasons, are really, really important to us. The first is always the McCarthy single malt. It has a number of firsts. It's the first spirit to use Oregon oak as the aging vessel, but it's also named after our mentor, Steve McCarthy, and a man who I wouldn't have a career without, and a career that I genuinely will spend, 80 hours a week working if need be. Not only that, it's also the first American single malt, and so we feel very lucky to have accidentally been first in a class. And to say it was accidentally is really the most honest thing we could do. There was no intention. Steve wanted to make a smoky, peaty whiskey, and he turned out creating American single malt. And that was really the only inspiration he ever really had. Short of that is definitely the pear brandy is so fond for all of us. It's our flagship. It's something we love. It is distinct and is kind of our archetype as a product. And of course the Old Delicious, which is a newer thing that we released. And similar to McCarthy's, it's an independent brand. It's an apple brandy aged in bourbon casks with kind of a complicated flipping of the bourbon barrel procedure that makes it a bridge to the past of what true American spirits really were. Everyone thinks that bourbon was the original main American spirit, but it wasn't. It was apple brandy. Johnny Appleseed was creating, he was planting apple trees to get people boozed up, not necessarily to keep doctors away. But if I had to say, short of that, what is my personal little one that I'm willing to stand on a box and say, drink this now, it's the Blue Plum Slivovitz. And that's kind of for greater purposes. The Slivovitz is an interesting spirit in general because it doesn't really have a home. It's the aroma of spirits. It belongs to all countries and is kind of borderless in its design. And as a result, you have different groups of people who really have a hand on it and say that this belongs to us. And so my friend Justin back in New York, he says, well, I'm Jewish and I grew up drinking this and this belongs to me and this is part of my culture. But my grandmother is from Poland and she says the exact opposite. She says, nope, this belongs to the Polish Catholics. But then my friend Aaron, he was just down in Croatia and he met a little old lady on the side of the road in Croatia who would tell you that this is hers. And so the fact that it can have this giant spread and this giant footprint on a map of human culture, but still be the same spirit is really unique because we love to put things in boxes. We love to say that like Champagne just belongs to these people and Calvados just belongs to these people and Scotch just belongs to these people. And yes, they do, and yes, they don't. But the real issue is these are all spirits. And for something that is like Slivovitz, which is just the distillate of the Damson plum, it really should never belong to anybody. And for that reason, it's always kind of my favorite because it should be shared equally without any sort of ownership. Because once it's owned, it's going to go away as unique.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also a really neat thing about the West Coast is that you see the capability of doing all of these things that have a much more traditional history and background in the old world, but we're still able to do them on a high quality level out here without kind of those laws and restrictions that can sometimes hinder growth. So Phil, let's get you involved a little bit here and get this one moving in the direction of kind of the history and recognition of alcohol production that we've had here in the Columbia Gorge.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to ask that question. I mean, Matt and Joe O'Sullivan would be much better to ask. I think what I would say though is my experience of spirits and beer and wine in the Hood River Valley. I started going to Hood River about 20 years ago when we first moved to Seattle. A friend of mine who now lives in in Bingen brought me there to see the wind and take part in the wind sports. And I was coming from Newfoundland. I was quite blown away by the land, by the country, the river, this huge body of water that ran through the rocks. And Full Sail was there. There were some small, I mean, Matt, you should definitely correct me here because you've obviously witnessed this. I'm saying this history from the perspective of a newcomer, really, 20 years now. But I remember Full Sail, and I loved their beer, and I was blown away by the place where you could sit outside on that amazing the outdoor patio there and have a beer and watch the windsurfers and kiteboarders on the river. And I remember some wineries. HRD was not really in my wheelhouse at that time because I didn't appreciate what they were doing. I saw the agriculture, simply by driving past it, but I didn't appreciate it as much as I do now in the Hood River Valley. And then I just spent more time there, and then the other breweries opened in town, and now the wineries have gotten better. One thing I was thinking leading up to this is the fact that we've left out the wineries. Y East is the winery right down the road from us, and we're going to have to do this same thing with the wineries included as well, because I think we're taking wine as well to another level in Hood River. And so I came at it. It's funny. The longer I've spent in this industry, the more I realize that most of the people who are involved with this are, well, first of all, we're people that we love knowledge. We're generally science background. We appreciate yeast mostly, but we also appreciate the science of these things, the precision of these things, like Matt was saying, but also there's a huge amount of art, and that combination is quite appealing for scientific people. It's why we do this rather than probably bake pastries or something. But so I had an interest in beer brewing when I was going to college, or university is what we would call it back where I'm from, and I was doing that here when I first got here, but then I started to, American beers started to become good when I after I moved here 20 years ago. Before that, they were good, but they were not as good as they are now. That's for sure. And so, and Hood River and the Northwest, Seattle and Portland were leading that charge, I think. And then I started to notice McCarthy's, and I also started to notice Balcones and these other early ones, Stranahan's, and that really tweaked my interest. I'm Canadian. I came from, my father drank not so great Scotch and reasonably good rye, Canadian rye, Crown mainly. So I did like whiskey from a very early time, but I didn't taste anything like particularly the single malt. I mean, I've always liked bourbons and ryes, but never as much as the malt whiskeys that we're making now here. And so it evolved, and then as I started to talk to people, it became obvious that we could grow the ingredients here in the Northwest. The barley could be grown here. The small malt houses were opening. The larger ones had already been here for a long time, as Matt would know. And so, yeah, and then as talking to people, including the guys at Westland and also Balcones and so on, it became, well, somewhat clear that we could potentially they could make what we wanted to make. And so then we were off and running as a small company, you know, and so taking it to this level where we've been able to work with Joe and Matt to make this whiskey that's now sitting in barrels is really, really nice for me. It's a full circle. It's I couldn't, well, I hope people like it. I hope people buy a lot of it, but just to have made it is really, really nice. And so, yeah, this is really quite a treat to have all of you here, and including Joe Castaldo. I mean, this, you know, having people from the East Coast and from South start to recognize and talk about us is really a treat. You know, it's great. It's good. I'm really happy to see that as well. You know. So I don't know if I answered your question. I didn't really give you a history of spirits and so on and beer in the Northwest or Hood River in particular, but a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, Cody.
Yeah, let's get Matt's take. It sounds like he's the community elder, I think, in this
Thanks.
situation.
Thanks so much.
You know, to my understanding too, it's only fitting that it should be a brewer to tell the story, because when I went back and I was looking at all of this, it seems like brewing is really at kind of the heart of where Oregon started with alcohol production back in kind of the early 1850s, if I'm not mistaken. And then Henry,
well, I mean, you really need to go back to like Blitz Weinhard. You know, I mean,
yeah.
One of the first breweries was in downtown Portland. And then they kind of owned the Portland scene for a long time. I love I love the old Rainier plant, the old Olympia plant, the Lucky plant that was in Vancouver. Just those old brick factories are so wonderful to me. And then people were so, if you remember the old Rainier beer ads, the old Blitz ads, it showed guys like at the Oregon coast in a driving gale, you know, storm, and they'd be just sitting outside, you know, without umbrellas, you know, just like, this is a nice day in Oregon. Such a fabulous amount of character of people that take, you know, regional pride in the beer out here. And then, but yeah, it was really one of the first microbreweries started in Portland, and they had a kind of a short run. The beer was allegedly kind of terrible. Dark, murky, and they lasted a couple of years, and then you had the emergence of Bridgeport, which made fabulous English style beers, and then the Widmer brothers with their Hefeweizen, and then Full Sail came along, where I worked for a number of years, and then there was a time when, you know, between Seattle and San Francisco and Portland, those were really like the beer centers of the craft brewing world, and it was an exciting time in the 80s and the 90s, and then Full Sail really drove that Hood River scene of bringing people out to the gorge. You know, everybody came out to windsurf and play in the water, and they had a this cool pub with a little bit of a Rastafarian vibe to it, with a bunch of, long-haired hippies, drinking beer and surfing. And it was a wonderful culture. And that culture kind of evolved a little bit. And so when I started Double Mountain, I'm like, let's just go back to the long-haired hippies drinking beer, So we just kind of pulled out their playbook from the early days of like, why don't we just have a good time and drink a lot of beer and make really strong beer and super hoppy beer, and that really resonated for people locally. And then watching the wineries when I moved to town in '94, and the wineries were here. They were interesting to take your guests to, but it seemed like the quality wasn't really there. And that's just, there's been so much resurgence and some great, local winemaking, and people are really, it's great to see that mature, like the beer world. And that's what's so exciting about what you guys are doing at Wanderback, is to bring, and McCarthy's Clear Creek is bringing that interest in the distilling world. And it's really like the next wave of the craft world, as I see it, is that interest in micro distilling and bringing out these great unique products that show off our Hood River agriculture. It's exciting. I'm into cider now, and so we're trying to do the same thing with cider. So it's a fun process.
Yeah, we're so spoiled out here. And for everybody watching this right now, something that we've kind of loosely been referencing here is a project that we kind of all collaborated on between Double Mountain, Clear Creek Distillery, and Wanderback to use some of this barley that we grow here on our farm up on Neal Creek Road, just about 10 miles south of the river, into a little hyper-local collaboration. So we took this barley that we've grown and added it into a grain bill that we then handed off to Matt and his team over there at Double Mountain to create the wash before making its way over to Joe and Clear Creek for distillation. Because as a lot of you know, we collaborate through those processes with partners when we want to make our new make spirit. So Matt, can you give us a little rundown kind of on the grains that were used, working with unmalted barley like we had coming off of our field for that, and if there was any surprises that you noticed in the process that jumped out at you?
No, it was interesting. I mean, I thought the mix that went into the grist threw a lot of character in the wash. You had some darker grains in there. Of course, you have the base of a malted barley, which has the enzymatic package to be able to break down the sugars, but then bringing in that unmalted barley in there, which could be a challenge to convert some of those sugars, was really kind of our goal. Is like, how are we going to handle this? Is it going to mill properly? So we did some test batches, and I know Terry at Great Western Malting was kind of instrumental in coming up with some of the mash programs to deal with the grain. And we have a fairly simple brewing system. It's a much like an English design. It's a one temperature, one shot, and you're done kind of deal. And what we did is we tried to kind of fake out our mash regime a little bit by coming in at a temperature that would maximize the conversion to try to get the most out of the grain that we could and the most character. But then we infused, keeping the mash quite dry, if you will, so the water ratio was a little low. We then could infuse some higher temperature waters to start to bring up that temperature. And so when we run that off, we had a good extract, and I thought we really got some of the characters and the flavorfulness out of the grain that way.
Yeah, I agree. I was really, really happy with it. When I saw what had come off at Clear Creek, it was really well done.
Would you mind going into a little more detail on how you did handle the grain, particularly all of the grain? Did you simply use your roller mill?
Yeah, we have a one-pass roller mill. It's actually a rice mill that was the original mill from Widmer Brothers. It was their first mill. They got it for a song. They sold it to me for a stanza of a song. So it was, we put together a kind of a real hodgepodge of used equipment when we started the brewery. So, but it's a big mill, and so our goal with the unmalted barley, which is going to be a lot harder and smaller, was to make sure that our gap settings were well for it. That we didn't have those gap settings that were too tight for the rest of the grain, so we didn't pulverize it into just a total flour. You need to preserve that husk character to be able to lauter correctly, to be able to set up a good filter bed in the mash tun. And so it was really, when we added the unmalted barley, we ran it through slow. We took a lot of sampling, and we found a gap that could be used for both all malts at the same time. So it made it convenient for the brewers not to have to readjust for the whole thing. So it's a little tighter than what we normally run. But we just ran it through a little slower to deal with it. And
so
how
would you compare that then to a hammer mill process? Would you say I mean, because that was one of the things I was really worried about, was how small those seeds were, if we were going to have those sugars available. And so, yeah, I hadn't actually talked to you much about that, but I'm interested to hear. Just would you say there were some characteristics of what you'd see from a hammer mill, or was it really like a roller mill type processing? Or
well, we ran it, like I said, we ran it tight, so we had a good pulverization of the barley. When you're brewing in a formal lauter tun type situation, you don't want to destroy the husk. You want to keep the shell, the outer seed, to be able to form a filter bed on the lauter bed, so you can drain through the liquid wort into the beer. Now, if I was a distiller in Kentucky and I'm doing corn and rice and barley, it's a totally different process. You're trying to just really make a flour, just totally expose everything that's totally possible. And then a lot of times after that mashing process, the whole thing would then transfer into the fermenter and get to, every distiller and brewer is different, but it's a little bit of a different process. So by making the wash in a brewery, it's really a little bit more of a delicate process than, say, approaching with a hammer mill. But yet we did, I feel, with those tighter settings and running it through fairly slowly, I thought we did get some really nice exposure of the grain. And it lautered well. That was our concerns. Like, we're going to create this thing and we won't be able to get the liquid out of the mash tun. And it did run off well. So I was excited that it worked, knock on wood. And so, I hope it's very successful. We'd like to do it again. So
how is that grain, that unmalted grain that came from our farm? How would you compare it in terms of its physical properties to what you would typically, to the regular malts that you're using?
Well, just one would be the physical size. So it's smaller. When you malt the seed, it's going to swell with moisture, so that the barley can get ready to grow a plant. That's what the malting process is really. It's a slow. It's taking those sugars that are there to grow a plant, getting them to start to grow. The roots start to come out of the barley seed, and then just when you're about 3 or 5 days growth on making a new plant, you then dry out that process and you stop the growth and arrest that conversion. And in that process, the seed has expanded, so it's much more plump. The density has gone down. There's an enzymatic system that's been created to really grow, to turn starches that are there to grow a plant. You're starting to break those down, and so there's alpha and beta amylase, the technical enzymes that are there to break down those sugars. You're developing them in that malting process, and so your unmalted barley, from up at Neal Creek, then wouldn't have had those enzymatic systems developed, and so you're really using the malted barley and the other malts that are in there to try to make that conversion. And you're also getting some pretty interesting characters, which I think is the idea out of the unmalted barley. So those large sugars and the proteins that would normally be broken down in a malted system are not. They're there in that. It's a different mix, and so you're getting different characters, different flavors, and a little bit more robustness, if you will, if you can call that a flavor. But I think I think it was quite interesting. Like we, drinking the wash straight out of the tank as it was fermenting. It's a beer now, without hops. It really did throw some interesting characters in it. And I'm anxious to taste the spirit that comes off.
I think, Cody, we're gonna talk a bit about how it's coming along. But just to give the listeners a sense for where it came from, so I wanted to grow. So the farm where we're at, where the distillery's at, had been a cherry and apple orchard for decades, and we gave a try to growing cherries, but it was a very small plot. It wasn't worthwhile, and so I really wanted to grow something, and it just fit with what I wanted to do with the whiskey to obviously grow barley. And barley can be grown in many, many climates, and it turns out where we are is a really nice place to grow barley. And I basically reached out to Pat Hayes, who heads the grain, I don't know what he calls that division of the Oregon State that he runs, but he basically is a barley expert, and he coached me on how to grow it, first of all. And then I asked him what types I should try, and it turned me towards Full Pint, which they developed there and grows really well in Oregon. And I made a few beers with it, and they tasted good. And I thought, this makes a lot of sense. Obviously, this is a grain that can grow well on the farm. And I've always liked Irish whiskeys. I've loved some of the Irish whiskeys that have used unmalted barley in their grain bill. And so I thought, and then talking to Joe, and then we worked with Terry, and it just seemed one thing led to another. And so, but that's where we came up with that type of barley. My hope in the future, we're going to continue to grow barley on the farm. And my hope is that we will be able to then add these unmalted barleys that I think we can really then speak to the terroir of that area, because you're using it unmalted. You're not changing it at all with the malting process that you talked about, Matt. So I think it's going to be good whiskey. I think we've followed some really great steps. It'd be fun to now get Joe's input on his thoughts, because I came to him and he was receptive as Joe is to most things. But I'd love to get your input, Joe, on your first impressions when I came to you with the idea, and how it sort of evolved, and getting Terry involved and all those things,
Well, my first impression was definitely, I don't want to overpromise. I think I can get this done. I certainly might screw this up. I hope we're all friends at the end. So.
I actually remember you saying that, Joe.
Pretty much.
Really?
It was like this is like a great. I like to set realistic expectations which come with the idea that we're going to give this a shot. It's a really great idea, but because we haven't really gone through a full trial, we don't really know where we're getting.
Right.
And so I tend to have more than anything a lazy approach to management of projects, where I just try to find people way smarter than me, and either convince them to be my lead distiller and my head of branding. That's Carrie right there. Or I turn to people like Terry Fernhoff, who is an incredible brewer in her own right, and really offered some really great advice and was really educational for me. And so working off of the grain bill that Phil and Wanderback had provided us, we were able to look at kind of what we wanted and what the overall yield was going to be. And I just kind of collected as much information as I could from Matt and from our own distillery and from Phil to try to get an idea of what we wanted to do and what the flavor characteristics were going to be. And that's when Terry and started making small adjustments to Phil's initial grain bill. And at the first time, it was pretty fun. I mean, we had to pull a little bit of a caper in terms of running a non-fermented wash in the back of my 1994 Toyota pickup in a sloshing giant fermenter, which had not been pitched with yeast yet. with yeast that I had swiped from Double Mountain the day before. And I mean, I can say that it was a well oxygenated yeast. It was, I could feel the back of my truck doing this the entire run. My brakes were also bad. I didn't include that. But that's just the hazard of the job. I got it to the distillery and pitched the yeast. It was one of the, you know, quick and dirtiest styles of pitching. I knew that it was going to be an approximation of what we were going to get.
How are we ever going
to ever going to be, right?
How are we going to ever replicate that?
You can't. We've lost the ability to replicate it when we're going from a 50-gallon test trial to I forgot how big the final wash was, but it was quite a bit. And so scaling would have immediately thrown off any variables that we could have really depended on. And if we wanted to hold tight and be pedantic, we could have been like, well, we have to pitch it at a certain temperature. But we'd already lost all of our control at that point, so it didn't really seem to matter. But what was really nice and encouraging was that test run went great. The very small kind of tweaks the tweaks that Terry had made were ultimately hugely beneficial. And that test run was super encouraging. And I remember having Wanderback in and Phil and Cody and Sasha to come in and test it and taste it. And we were all really impressed. There was a lot of character to it. It was chocolatey and rich. And it was different than other single malts. Like, it had distinct quality that was unique. And I could see that, yeah, this is something that was really worth trying. And that was really the moment that we decided to go full hog on this. Because one of the things that a lot of people don't quite understand is that we have stills and we have other stills, and then we have like many other stills. These are a machine that they extract alcohol from a solution, but they were all designed to complete one purpose under different cultures at different times throughout human history. So they're all different. And so while they all share the same name as a still, they all function very differently. So how my stills operate is different than how a still is going to operate from any other manufacturer. Like these are Holstein stills. They're very different than Vendome stills, and they produce a different spirit at the end, even though they have the same name. So what was going to work in mine might not work in someone else's, and vice versa. But initially, the flavor profile was so interesting and so encouraging that we decided to work with this on a larger project, and that's when we brought in Matt. And Matt again made wise little adjustments to the grain bill. I'm not a brewer. I can brew. Like I can make a decent beer. No one's going to get sick from my beer, but I'm not a great brewer. I'm just a decent one. And
quit underselling yourself, will you?
Nah, I'm more comfortable that way. Yeah. But, you know, working with Matt and kind of getting his advice, because he's an expert in that particular field, he made some more small adjustments. And what we got at the very end wasn't just a replication of what those test runs were with these high chocolate notes, but it was a magnification of it. And so his system was able to pull out more of the all-stars. It went from being a collection of flavors that were all really nice and worked wonderful as a soup, and all came together to come around really highlighting specific qualities that made it more palatable as a raw spirit that you wouldn't have gotten if it hadn't gone through his system. And given the attention by him and Jen and all the other people and Greg at his brewery. But when it finally came out and when it was finally done, it was one of the more interesting distillations I'd done in a while. Because I've mostly, with whiskey, been making just McCarthy's. I like making whiskey a lot. Making single malt whiskey in particular is tons more fun than any other whiskey. Mostly because of how it changes. The heads cut, which is mostly the nasty stuff like methyl alcohol, methanol, isopropyl alcohol, things like that. They taste terrible, but at the very end, there's the tails. And the tails is going to be the fusel oils, which are really muddy and yucky tasting. They just kind of taste sour, not very good. And what's in between is the hearts. And the hearts are what you find in your bottle. The hearts are what taste really great. A distiller, when they're approaching a distillate, will really look for transitions that start at the beginning of the heads cut. I'm sorry, at the beginning of the heads cut, all the way to the beginning of the tails cut, where you finally say, we're done collecting alcohol. What you want is this evolution of flavor that might start off with one characteristic, let's say total chocolate malt, and might end another way, which is a subtle oatmeal quality. And you saw this transition in this particular experiment, where you had an evolution of flavor that always seemed to complement, but you didn't have too many notes. You can have a great song that can have 1,000 notes and 1,000 keys, but it's really kind of difficult to listen to, and maybe only the most educated of us will get it. Or you can have a song that hits complementary points all the way across. And because flavor is really difficult to describe, because we have so few words for it, we have to kind of rely on synesthetic style metaphors. And this was a song that had just a few notes in that octave that all worked well together in harmony. And I'm incredibly excited for it, because what I do know about Wanderback, and the first thing that impressed me about them, was the barrel maintenance of which they go into. And that's something that I personally get absolutely fascinated by when Bartolome and I are designing kind of what our next McCarthy's batch is going to be. We ultimately always come at it and most other things from two different angles. And we are always looking for some sort of harmony of what balances things out really well. But with the Wanderback brew, you had, I would say, 4 or 5 different high points of flavor that your mind attaches to right away, but they were all at nice levels that seem to play off each other. And I'm really excited for where this is going to go, because I'm in the middle, right? Like, I'm unfinished. I don't really know where this will go for me, and I certainly didn't create it because that was Matt. And I just really can't wait for the next 3 years or however many you want it to be, for this to be released, because I do think it's going to be something that's unique and something that the local community can take a lot of pride in.
That's great. Music to my ears. You've touched on a number of things that are interesting. The people who drink whiskey, not all of them realize the components and the various steps that go into making, good whiskey. Same with good beer and wine. I'm really curious to see where this is going to go as well. But the great thing about this project, I think in the end we're going to be happy with what comes out, as long as we keep making good choices. But it's been really fun to gather the knowledge from all of you, Matt and Joe, in particular, in making this. Because I come at this with a more general knowledge, and a taste that I was trying to achieve with the whiskey, but a more general knowledge. And it's been really, really fun to work with both of you, particularly to make this. What a treat to be able to collaborate. We talk about collaborating and working as a community, and I think we do pretty well in the Hood River Valley. But to do this, because like you say, there's physical distance that separates us. I mean, we're in the same Hood River Valley, but we're separated. And even just getting things around, like getting our grain over to Matt, and then Matt getting the wash over to Joe, and then transferring it over to the barn on Neil Creek. There's various things that could have gone wrong on those and various steps, and I'm awfully glad they didn't. But it is a real treat to collaborate, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of it. But maybe we can touch now on what we're seeing so far, Cody, because you've been monitoring things the closest on what you've seen, and we can touch on a few of the things that we're sort of paying attention to now in the early stages of the maturation of this whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just kind of starting to kick off. I will say though that new make spirit that we ended up getting surprised me in just how kind of clean it was, just
Yeah.
after everything had been put together. Because one thing I don't know if it had gotten mentioned, Joe, but you guys are actually running 4 different stills. And in the process of this new make spirit coming off these stills, you're getting different flavors coming off of each independent still. So when we combined all those things, like you were saying, there were these high note flavors of like chocolate and citrus that were really just kind of jumping out. And those things, especially the chocolate, we can definitely see is going to be a predominant flavor in the end product of this whiskey, which is something
it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. Sorry to interrupt, but it's pretty fun to watch Joe and his crew there work the equipment they have, because like you say, it's 4 different stills. They look quite similar to the outsider, but they all operate differently and they have different characteristics. And I mean, Joe and his crew, they know these things like they're their little children. And you know, they would be making cuts, and they'd be talking to me and making cuts, and I was a little bit nervous because I thought we were going to miss things. But they run these stills, well, they've been running them for a while, so they know how they work. But it's pretty fun to watch. So, but you're right, the new make, the clear spirit, the new make that came off those stills was super clean, and we did that on purpose. I mean, we tried to make a new make, Joe, that would not have required an extended aging period because of the cuts, particularly going, you know, longer into the tails, for example, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah. So what are you seeing now, Cody?
Oh, I'm just kind of seeing an enhancement of the chocolate notes that were there, as well as kind of the orange citrusy notes.
Right.
Still kind of showing through, but it's still really early, and we haven't even begun to hit the hot stretches of the season yet.
Yeah.
But we do have an interesting question here for you guys, because we are kind of getting to our 1 hour mark, from Joe C. And he wants to know, other than the collaboration that we've already planned and done and barreled, are there any additional plans that we all have for the future whiskey blends between multiple distilleries, finished whiskeys and local ex-beer casks, or any kind of cask sharing between the 3 of us? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll cover a little bit of that. I know Joe and I have worked closely together on a number of projects, the McCarthys. We get quite a few of their apple brandy barrels that we repurpose for some cider aging. And we've been talking whiskey for some time of doing some Double Mountain whiskeys moving forward. And I'm just sitting here at this event. I'd like to try floor malting some barley, you know, coming off of Neil Creek, and doing a beer, a standalone beer with that barley. I think would be super fun. And
It
so
would.
my mind races when I'm, you know, involved with people like this. So I'm excited to move forward.
Yeah,
Awesome.
no doubt. I mean, we definitely intend. We're hoping that we can keep doing this. We hope that we will be able to keep doing this type of whiskey that we've just talked about a lot. But yeah, no doubt. I mean, moving barrels back and forth, and I would love to make a beer with that, with the barley, and that would be super fun. I think the consumers and people visiting Hood River would love to see that.
Yeah.
So yeah, no question. Yeah, there's no question. And it's really fun. The beer and the whiskey, particularly the thing about single malt, one of the defining characteristics is the whiskey comes from one distillery. So swapping whiskey blends, it wouldn't fit in the single malt, but it would fit in other categories. But what's really fun is the way that beer and this type of whiskey really fit together. They taste good together. They start out very similarly without the hops in the whiskey case, unless you're making a hopped whiskey. So it's a natural partnership, and it's been really fun. It makes a lot of sense. We live in a place where we have an abundance of water and energy that's good energy, and we can grow these ingredients right here, and so it makes sense for us to be making this type of product where we are.
what the area really needs is, if we could have a pie in the sky dream, is a malting house.
Yeah, no doubt.
More than anything. I mean, you give me a shipping container, a few hundred yards of metal mesh, a Roomba, and a heating unit, and I'll malt a bunch of.
I got a parking lot you can do that in.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
But I do really like these sorts of collaborations, mostly because it allows me, and I think all of us, honestly, it allows us room for experimentation where the burden is shared amongst all parties. And to say that I learned something from this is an understatement. It immediately got me and my wheels spinning about additional whiskeys that I would want to make for my own brand, which I'd want to incorporate all of you in, because we can push this a lot further by being communal in our efforts and how we source things.
Well, if you need a taste tester, I'll sign up for that job right there.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, that's great. You know, I mean, we're entering a weird time now where people want to, I think people are going to want to get out, and people in Seattle and Portland, we need to give them an excuse to come to the Hood River Valley if they didn't already have one. And this type of working together and ultimately trying to make a better product, but using this sort of collective knowledge that that we have is, I think it's the way to get people here. And ultimately, that's what we want. We want people to like our product, and we want people to visit our region and come and spend a bit of time and go back with an appreciation of our brands, you know. And so this is, I think this is a great way to do it. And I'm really psyched. I'm really happy to hear both of you, Joe and Matt, enjoy the project and are open to doing more of it, you know.
100%.
That's great.
I have a question for Joe Castaldo, all the way over there. Does this make you want to come and visit us more? I hope.
It does. It does. So, you know, I travel for work. I'm an engineer by trade as well. So hopefully maybe one day I find myself in either brewing or distilling whiskey. But I do travel to Portland area a few times a year. So hopefully once the travel restrictions lift and I have to travel for work, I will make my way over to Hood River next time, because it's only about an hour drive out. So yeah, I would love to come visit you guys, come see the farm, meet you, and shake you guys' hands in person and drink some whiskey with you guys.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's a special area. It's a really special area, and yeah, to give people another excuse to come out, this type of excuse, I think is great. So we'd love to have you.
Yeah, be a pleasure to come out there and join you guys. I've been through the Hood River area before. I've been over to Madras, and just like that, those plains are gorgeous. The desert's beautiful. The mountains are gorgeous. So I mean, and like I said, I'm having Crater Lake tonight. I tried Wanderback. There's some great stuff going out in that area of the world. So really, just really excited to get out there.
Perfect.
Love to have you.
So should we wrap it up here now? We've had a really great chat. I don't want to take any more of your Sunday. It is Sunday. I'm losing track of days with this bloody virus, but it's been really nice to talk to you guys. I really appreciate your time. I know it's Sunday afternoon, and look forward to seeing you all soon. I hope you stay healthy in these funny times, and I hope we can all get together and have a beer and a nice whiskey sometime together soon.